You are. All right. Back with another episode of Patriarchy Podcast. I am here with Fletcher,
Hello, good night, and good evening.
all in one. And we are going to be talking about the origin of consciousness. It's quite a topic. It is probably a topic that's definitely going to be some other, well, you could say esoteric, exoteric, maybe even just plain old fashioned fun, but maybe nonsense, maybe not nonsense. I mean, who knows? It's all consciousness, right? So it's got to come from somewhere.
Yeah, I mean the it's a huge topic, obviously, and I mentioned it a little bit a while ago. Like, um, the best thing I think a best natural place to start with is that, like, it's like, okay, you know, who am I? Like, why am I interested in this? And what do I know about this at all? Like, what have I read? What have I thought about? Like, let's just break it down a little bit. Like, so the reason why I want to talk about this, and we, have been talking about doing a podcast on it, or stream for quite a while. And the thing is, there's basically three people in my life that have made me think about this. Besides, over the course of time, like, after college, and probably a lot like 6 years ago, 5 years ago, really start thinking about it. Um, and but before that, there was my dad, would say things about being conscious, as far as, like, not just like, okay, snap your fingers, wake up, are you there, messing with you or whatever, but like, not just saying, like, did you think before you act, and that type of stuff. I'm talking about, like, the way that psychologists think about consciousness, and the way that neuroscience and um, doctors and what have you would think about consciousness. And he would basically go like, look, you're a historically minded person, Fletcher, and you are getting degrees in history, and you are really into ancient history. But do you know that the people that lived back then, way back then in the annals of time, I'm talking, let's say, Old Kingdom Egypt, were not conscious. And that's kind of what he would mess with me in a way, because he thought it was fun. And I'd be like, what do you mean? And I'm talking about, like, imagine like a little Fletcher, like a 13, 14-year-old Fletcher. And, he would say this stuff to me in high school and stuff like that. And it would come up periodically. So that's kind of the genesis, or the beginning of how I've thought about consciousness. And then it and like the other two people that came into my life that talked about it in any type of serious way also brought up a similar person, in this idea that people were not fully conscious, even in, probably like recorded history, going back in deep history. Um, and the two people were people that, one person was a friend that I got about 5 years ago, very smart guy, computer scientist, uh, believing Christian, someone that actually is a Christian. And the other person was someone that I kind of met maybe 2 years ago and some change, 2.5 years ago. And the thing that they had in common is that they brought up a guy named Julian Jaynes. Um, and this was a psychologist that in the 60s and 70s developed a kind of theory of consciousness, if you will, about how it originated. And I had never heard of this guy until about 5 years ago. And then, and it has this thing called a bicameral mind. And my friend gave me an article on it. It was like a secondhand article, but it was enough to get the engine going. It was enough to get the sparks flying. And then I also had been interested in Carl Jung, like Jungian psychology, and also just the origin of psychology. It's always fascinated me, even as like a high school kid, basically college kid. Um, I didn't major in psychology. I don't have degrees in psychiatry or psychology or neuroscience or neurobiology or something like that. But that's been kind of a side interest of mine. So that's how I got into it. And so when I bring the people that I'm going to talk about are the early psychologists a little bit, namely Jung, and then just a little bit. And then I'm going to talk about Julian Jaynes. That's the idea that I have in my head, so to speak, of how we should go about it. And then finally, I'm going to talk about Gene Gepster, a guy that wrote Ever Present Origin, who talks about the development of consciousness as well. And so that's what I'm bringing to the table, essentially. And I think when you piece these people together and their ideas and their thesis, you can kind of weave a certain type of understanding that begins to make sense of what we call consciousness. But I think it's kind of important to start with. I think it's kind of important to start with just right off the bat, right? Like, what do you think of when you think of consciousness? I told you, how I thought about it, right? And how I got interested in it or whatever. When you were like, can you remember how it even came up in your life? Thinking about it in some sort of way.
Oof. Wow. That's.
Did it have any like religious context? Did it have
yeah. It definitely had religion. Yeah. It's kind of hard to think about. I think it's hard to think about conscientious without some kind of religious context, whether you're thinking in a secularized format or a philosophical format. The obvious one, theological. You're always going to think of consciousness of something in a theological format with religion tied into that. But what really sparked my interest were flat out the martial arts and the philosophy brought to the table with that and the various implications as to how nature operates, how everything functions as a part of a cycle or having a very cyclical nature to the representation, the symbology, symbolism, and typologies. I know that's we're getting into Jung territory early with that one, and then you see it like as we've done podcasts together. Obviously, tying into the martial arts. We talked about this before with the Star Wars stuff, and the Star Wars stuff actually, as far as pop culture goes, well, it's pop culture, but it has that context to it where important.
Yeah, I mean, I see what you're saying. Like, I mean, it's like, okay, if you practice, combat sports, if you practice athletics, incidentally enough, you're going to become aware of consciousness because sometimes it gets in the way of what you're doing. And you're going to be aware of it, right? Because you have different tasks that you're trying to do, different techniques that you're trying to develop and perfect. And so you start thinking about those type of things in a really pragmatic way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that makes sense, and like, so I think it's useful to let's like talk about, most people have heard of some things that like Carl Jung brought up. Now, Carl Jung was a psychologist in the late 1800s, for those that don't know, and he was somebody that, as a German or Swiss psychologist, you have to remember, like, it wasn't that long ago in the historical record, right? It's like 130 years ago when he wrote his dissertation, I think, I think right in the year 1900. Okay. And so, turn of the century, what we think of psychology was just starting to be formed. And you have guys like William James, in our history in America, who is a psychologist who develops the philosophy of pragmatism, um, that Jordan Peterson will reference sometimes. Um, you also have his William James kind of studying parapsychology, which is kind of a subset of psychology where you start looking at literally paranormal activity, whether it be like, weird stuff like Ouija boards or seances and stuff like that, which was really in fashion in the late 1800s. Carl Jung was a medical student, like Freud, who, he wasn't a student of Freud, but they corresponded together, and they definitely, um, you know, bounced ideas off each other, and it was definitely a kind of mentor relationship at first, with Freud being the mentor and Jung being the student. Now, they differed. They ended up differing quite a bit, and this podcast isn't about their relationship or how they differed. But the reason why I bring up Jung to get back to the topic of consciousness is because he developed some concepts that you probably hear in common nomenclature. Like, you've probably heard of the word introvert. Well, that's a Carl Jung term. The idea that there are certain people that have less enthusiasm, extroversion, which is basically enthusiasm. It doesn't mean that they're sad people. It means that they don't get energy. They don't feel revived from being in crowds or in big groups or talking to people necessarily. It doesn't mean that they don't like that necessarily, but it means that they're probably more introspective. They probably like to be alone more, etc. That's introvert. Another concept that he developed was something called synchronicity, which is interesting. Probably the most kind of esoteric topic that concept that he came up with. And synchronicity is when, like, you say, for example, I'm thinking about how I really love salted caramel ice cream, and and all of a sudden, I see a flash of somebody pulls out salted caramel ice cream or brings it up as well, or I see it on the TV screen or something. And that's a coincidence, right? But synchronicity is a meaningful coincidence. And so you obviously wouldn't think that that's very meaningful. I'm just using that as an illustration. You can take that, though, and think of things like when, I don't know, like you might feel a certain way, like you're just feeling really sad or something, and there's a song, and then a song comes on the radio that makes you nostalgic about a time that you were sad, and it's like the song, or of a handful of songs that you just really that you really connect with for that emotion, and it came on in the instant that you were thinking about it. Boom, that's synchronicity. Okay. And I think we can all agree that that happens. Now, what you take from that and what meaning you have from it, is up for argument. But that's just one thing. Another thing that he developed was this notion of the collective unconscious. So when we think about the collective unconscious, it circles back to another topic that he came up with. Well, he didn't come up with it, but he popularized archetypes. He certainly didn't come up with it. But what he was saying with the collective unconscious is that there are certain archetypes that are perennial in nature, that no matter where you're at or who you are, you will be able to identify with them. So what is an example? An example of a universal archetype would be the father, right? Or the mother, or the warrior or the magician, you know, the shaman. These are some archetypes. And he has all sorts of students that are Jungian in nature. Personally, the ones that are worth paying attention to are not many, but there was a guy that wrote a book called The King, the Warrior, and the Magician. And that's a book that's really short, and I would recommend it to people if they're interested. It's a good primer on basic archetypes for men. The other thing is that he had a student that was probably his best student. That guy that wrote that book isn't his student. He came like a generation later. But a woman named Marie Louise von Franz directly studied under him and was able to, even though her works have to be translated, to write like more legibly and more understandably for a common audience to digest. Because if you read any Jung, you'll quickly find out that a lot of times it's fucking gibberish. Sorry, excuse my French, but it's just how it is, man. He wasn't a good writer, or at least it didn't translate well into English, in my opinion. So it's important that if you're interested in this stuff, to find people that are able to popularize it. Now, obviously, the people that are listening to this podcast or the stream will immediately think of Jordan Peterson, you know, and that's fair enough, you know, and I will say I had, you know, an interest in psychology, like I've said, before Jordan Peterson, but he reignited that interest for sure in me. So the idea of collective unconscious, you know, you will have these very profound feelings and inclinations towards things, like the notion of, you know, the kind of wizard magician, you know, intellectual, right? Don't get too caught up on the word magician, you know, just think of it as like a scholar, or, you know, like a, not necessarily an alchemist, but yes, an alchemist would fall under that. An academic would fall under that. And then you have the archetype of a shaman, and that would be like someone that's mystical. You know, a priest would be like that, most likely. There's overplay, there's overlap, and that's kind of the gist of what I think Carl Jung brings to the table when you're talking about the origin of consciousness, just to make it.
Well, if you notice that almost every like RPG role-playing game has that set up, those archetypes set up already in the games. Like if you go pick, or if you go into an RPG based on, I don't know, you know, it could be anywhere in the realm of like sci-fi all the way to, you know, fantasy, which I'm talking about like the classical, you know, fantasy, the Dungeons and Dragons type stuff.
Yeah.
You have your archetypical characters, which would be warrior, mage, or wizard.
Priest, or a cleric, I think.
Cleric, yeah.
And you're exactly right. And so, and you know, I think so if we accept that there is some sort of inclination towards that's not arbitrary, then we start opening the door to thinking about things that evolve, and not evolve, but things that involve your identity that aren't necessarily very personal, right?
Well,
that
it's a manifestation. Yeah.
And so I start thinking like, okay, how do, you know, when we think about like, just to get, you know, because my strength is history. And so like I start thinking historically, and I start thinking about like, okay, deep history and going into the Paleolithic and Neolithic and into the Bronze Age, where you start having actual what we think of as civilizations, and you're immediately forced to contend with the fact that at a certain point, things were developing in the Near East, or what people call the Middle East, Mesopotamia, and there's what we would call civilization. You have surplus agriculture and the specialization of labor to a certain degree, and a kind of society that we can more or less recognize. That's not pastoral. It's not hunter and gather based. It's like, okay, there's a city and there's a king and so on, right?
Right, and there's a manifestation with that hierarchy too. So you automatically have those archetypes working through the civilization to establish that hierarchy that's already there. And like, as it's funny because when this is automatically reminding me of Jordan Peterson, where he says even the people who don't think there's a hierarchy, they automatically establish a hierarchy. He goes, you think with a group of children, they're automatically going to establish a pecking order. And how? Oh, well, you have games, right? So you have the game of,
like, yeah, a game of like
let's
hide and
just
go
as simple
seek, or
as person,
who's gonna
hide and go seek. Yeah. Who's gonna
who starts it?
as
Who's gonna
yeah,
lead the decision making on what you're gonna play?
right. Who's going to be the ones to pipe up, who are going to be the ones to sit back and say, all right, we'll play this for a while and then we'll move on to the next one. Or be, a mixed bag of personalities. But the other part is that it's like, well, then you're going to have then you're going to, as those children grow up, then you're going to have the archetypical, personality traits. Who's going to be the leader, who's going to be the one back, who's going to be the one that winds up with the wrong crowd, who's going to be the high school jock that has a beer gut, um, you know 50 years later, and he's sitting at the same hometown bar talking about his glory days when he was a quarterback, right? And I mean, there's all those kind of things rolled into, obviously, complex circumstances too have something to do with it. um, and I
Yeah, I mean, you're right, and
I
in
think that
that,
there's issues. uh yeah, I know that kind of goes into like a little bit more of an evolutionary, I guess, kind of
yeah, and
background with that.
it's connected to consciousness, and for sure. I mean, when you're delineating, those type of things and establishing hierarchy and in this thing, but this is where I'm going to kind of go into, I think, what might be and hopefully is kind of new for your audience and people listening, is one of the guys I mentioned earlier, which is Julian Jaynes. And he was a psychologist in the 60s, and he writes, he starts dealing with the problem of consciousness, or the issue of consciousness, or whatever, however you want to frame it, and how it's developed. And he writes this work on the origin and history of consciousness. And the thing about, I think, that's helpful for us is that a good place to start. Okay. That's, again, like I said, this topic is very challenging. It's deep, it's profound, um, but let's start with what consciousness is not in Julian Jaynes' framework, because it's helpful to let's identify what it's not. And this might seem counterintuitive to people listening. It did to me, but it'll make sense, I think, later on. So,
Well, I mean,
yeah,
I don't think that's completely counterintuitive, because you have to think about those various manifestations, because you're going to have, like, what's not a good thing to do, what is a good thing to do. Are those conscious choices? Are those like choices that we make because we make it out of bad decisions, or we make it out of good decisions? Are,
yeah, and so
are we
yeah,
going to have good people making bad decisions, making good decisions?
and so what you're talking,
There's a lot of overlap with that.
yeah, and what you're touching on is, like, okay, so consciousness is not instincts. Okay, so you have an instinctual drive to, use the bathroom, eat food, have shelter, right? You can also frame this as Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But these things that are instinctual drives that all animals have, including humans, are not conscious. Um, there are routines that you have beyond the instincts. And this gets into behaviorism a little bit, which, you know, I have my own hangups about like BF Skinner and all that, but I don't want to get derail it. What I'm saying is that, consciousness in his view is, and I agree with it, is not sense perception. It's not, you know, the things that you take in, because it can't be that, because all animals have sensory perception. They feel things, they touch things, they see things, they hear things, etc. That's not consciousness. It's not everything we do. It's not, it's also not copying experience like a page or a camera, to use a metaphor. Um, it's not like, okay, just because you can kind of get a routine going, that proves that you are being conscious in those acts. It's like, again, it's not like, it's not even necessarily writing things down. And you'll know that because depending on what you're doing, especially like clerical data entry type stuff, it's not conscious. It's like you're just going through the motion, boom, 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 boom. Um, and so if you think about this as another example you can give that he gives is like when you're on a telephone or a cell phone or whatever, you know how the numbers have letters that correspond, right? Well, no one really knows, like, even though we use it all the time, you don't know like what the letter is to the number, even though you might memorize a number. It's, and you see it all the time, you do it all the time, and it's just, again, like a habit or a routine. um if you think about, like, when you remember stuff, also, see, this is a big thing that people sometimes confuse with, like, I'm conscious, or it's conscious to remember something, your memory. Because, like, when you think about, like, um when you remember, like, when you're swimming, right? It's not like you learn how to to ride a bicycle or swim, that you, when you're engaged in those activities, whether it's swimming or riding a bike, it's like muscle memory, right? It's not like you're conscious while you do it, because if you were conscious while you're doing it, you'd probably fall off the bike or stumble or, drown or, or gulp water or whatever. um so, and this is kind of goes into, like you said earlier, with martial arts, and to a degree, I think, for sure. And when you're engaged in sparring, or if you're actually fighting somebody, that all, I think people can grasp that. And so if you accept that, then we start getting to a place where, okay, consciousness is not instincts. It's not everything we do. It's not copying things, and it's not even remembering things. Um, and if you basically think about, like, how you remember, when you're like recollecting, like, you went swimming at the pool today. Well, if you were really remembering what you were doing, you kind of view yourself from a different angle. When I think about, okay, I went swimming, and I see myself from a different angle, like almost like you're up in the sky, right? Looking down on yourself swimming. You don't remember, like, you don't reenact the thermo activity, of swimming. You don't start breathing the way you were breathing when you were swimming. But when you were swimming, you were doing all these different things. But when you're remembering it, you're not. You're actually, like I said, stepping back from it and looking down on it in a way. And so that is, even in all that, it's not conscious, according to Julian Jaynes. And when we think about like Pavlovian conditioning, right? Like another psychologist, when he famously like was able to prove that you can condition a when you can condition a an animal, like when you're training them to come to dinner or something like that to have their food, like they'll salivate when they see that you're opening up the bag of food to give them, because they've associated the bag of food with you with them eating. So it conditions a response of salivating before they eat, in a nutshell. And so that conditioning is not proof of consciousness because animals do it. And we can agree that pretty much everybody knows that animals, or at least they assume animals, aren't conscious. I've already touched on motor skills, like I said, riding a bike. And then lastly, I think even if you verbalize stuff, this is the real kicker. This is like my mind kind of like gets blown when I start thinking about this. It's like just the fact that you can make a decision. See, this is where he kind of splits with like most people's initial inclination is they think, well, wait a minute, like if I make a decision and I can even verbalize that decision, then surely I'm being conscious when I do that. And he kind of says, he doesn't kind of say, he says that that's not conscious. Okay. And this is where, like, going back to what my dad said when I was a kid, like, Fletcher, even the people that built those pyramids might not have been conscious. And this is where, mind becomes blown. Because you're like, how could people do these things, these monuments, and not be conscious? And this is where, like, he starts getting, kind of like, it's like, whoa, so basically what he puts forth is, okay, so what is consciousness? So what he says, and I'm reading directly from the source, he has 4 ideas or models of his theory. First, the nature of consciousness and its origin is in language, which can be empirically studied in the learning of consciousness in children, as well as the study of changes of consciousness in recent history. The second idea that he puts forth is the bicameral mind, which can be studied directly in ancient texts and indirectly in modern schizophrenia. And I'll touch on that in a minute. Third, what he puts forth is the idea that consciousness followed bicamerality, the division of the mind, which can be studied in the artifacts and texts of history, that this is relying on history and relying on documentation. And fourth is the neurological model for the bicameral mind as it relates to the 2 hemispheres. Most people might know about the right and left brain, right? The right brain is considered the more creative part of your brain. It's the one that it's the kind of, through imaging, we can see that is more engaged when you're doing things like artwork, thinking of new ideas, that type of thing. And the left brain is when you're doing mathematical, it could be analytical, mathematical calculations, that type of thing. And that's the left brain, the analytical brain. And so what he has is it leaves us with a different view of human nature. It suggests that what civilized us all is a mentality that we no longer have, in which we heard voices that they thought were gods. So I'm going to go back to what his second claim was, which was the bicameral mind. So what does he mean by a bicameral mind? Okay, so basically, in a nutshell, if you have like we can tell through like He uses historical examples like Mesopotamia, like the earliest civilization, of when of how people prayed to a god, and how they would have idols literally, and they would be giving offerings to the idols, and that you're like, okay, well, what does that have to do with like voices in their head? And this is the thing that's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable for me to talk about it in a way, but it's not. Yeah, it's like you have to push through that, because I'll preface and caveat it with, I don't in any way think that um, this negates a god or a creator or anything like that, but it does. It is kind of like when you say that people heard voices. They literally say like God spoke to them, and it gives direct commands. The way that these people write about it, and I'm not just talking about the Old Testament. I'm talking about documentation from before, the writing of the Old Testament. And when we're going back to like, it would be essentially the Sumerians in the city of Ur and Uruk, and also the Babylonians later. And we see that we have like fragments left from their correspondence with other administrators or other dignitaries and these type of things, where the ruler is concerned that they're no longer hearing their god, and this is obviously causing a kind of stress to them. Okay, like you would imagine if you were hearing voices in your head that was, and this is what's key, is that it's not just like I'm hearing voices in my head all the time, and they are telling me any number of things like we think of maybe schizophrenia, though it is similar in the sense that what you have to understand is that when someone is schizophrenic, they don't just hear like a voice saying whatever, though they could. They usually hear it as a command, like you need to do this. You need to go outside. You need to go before the idol, and you need to give libations and incense, and you need to slaughter a goat or something, right? That's what they're hearing in ancient times. And in today's time, doctors, neuroscientists, what have you, or people that try to help people that are diagnosed with schizophrenia, that's what they're contending with. And it's the supposition of Julian Jaynes that this was going on during the Bronze Age collapse, um, probably for the first time, as far as we can tell, with these people. So as far as like, what's the difference between what happened before the Bronze Age versus what happened during the Bronze Age? We were talking about like going back to the old kingdom in Egypt. So Egypt is divided into old, middle, and new. And if you go back to the split between the old kingdom and the middle kingdom, there was a temporary collapse of their civilization, and there was an interregnum period of chaos. And Julian Jaynes is saying that part of what led to that was a breakdown of what he calls the bicameral mind, where you have these two hemispheres of our brain, which we now know, like I said, through imaging, which Julian Jaynes didn't have that technology of MRI like that developed in the 80s to prove it. But he was basically right in the sense of like there is something like the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere of the brain. And it is like when these people have these kind of voices in their head coming from the right hemisphere. And so that model, that fourth idea that he had out of the four things that I said earlier, it really kind of it really makes it something that you just have to contend with. Now, so what does he say, a little bit more about, like, okay, what was going on when it's not like people uh, all across the world were experiencing this at the same time. Um, though he does later in some of his papers get to deal with, like, he's pulling from, like, anthropology, ancient history, but he was able to get experts in these fields and also talk about what was going on in China at the same or near the same time. And what you get is, like, again, it's not like a, a snap or a break, in everywhere that existed. We only have documentation for a certain amount of areas to begin with, but also that, you know, it's it's like it's like, imagine, like, it's kind of like, I think about it like the collapse of the Roman Empire. Like, it wasn't like the Western Roman Empire fell and all at once in 475 AD the lights go off across Western Europe. It was like the lights start going off, so to speak, in this pocket of the Roman Empire and that pocket of the Roman Empire. And then over the course of several generations, you have, basically the Europe turns into something else other than the Roman Empire. And in the same sense, Julian Jaynes is saying that kind of went on most likely throughout different peoples at different times, roughly beginning with the Bronze Age collapse. So I know that is a mouthful and a lot to take in, but that kind of gets us to, like, the next step.
Of the bike. That's interesting though, because it's like that distinction between instinct and what. Because you see, the thing is like you don't think of instinct as anything more than, well, a conscious choice, because you sure, there's instinct that you have to do something, but not everybody's instinct is the same, and not everybody's consciousness is the same.
Yeah.
I mean, there's generalizations, like there's right and wrong, which is a very good and bad, which is all, well, innerly subjective, but outwardly more objective, which is strange because it could also be reversed with that too, because of the way people think.
Yes, and I mean, in so, like, I'm basically gonna talk about, like, if we talk about, like, I give some historical examples to, like, crystallize it a little bit further. In Egypt, we find that the bicameral mind broke down between what is called the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom, and then again between the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom. The evidence for these dark, chaotic periods is the hieroglyphic writings after they occurred. But in Mesopotamia, which was the most stable civilization in the world, there does not seem to have been a breakdown until about 1400 BC. In the graphics of the period, gods are no longer depicted. In some instances, kings beg in front of empty god thrones. Nothing like that had even occurred before in Mesopotamia. Another line of evidence is in the Cuneiform literature, so the writing of the time. There's an epic called the Epic of Telukti Nitora, where for the first time in history, gods are spoken of as forsaking human beings. The greatest literature of the period, which is possibly the origin of the Book of Job, is what is called the Ludlu Bel Nefi. Now, I butchered the pronunciation of that, but anyway, the first readable line of which translates as this: "My God has forsaken me and disappeared. My goddess has failed me and kept at distance. The good angel who walked beside me has departed." How similar to some of the Hebrew Psalms. For example, if you look at Psalm 42, the reasons for this breakdown are several. The success of bicameral civilizations, meaning civilizations that occurred before this breakdown, right, leads to overpopulation, and as describes in the text from the period, there are various huge catastrophes such as the volcano Thera, eruption, which is well known and may be the origin of Plato's myth of Atlantis, the ensuing tsunamis that crushed all the bicameral kingdoms around the part of the Mediterranean. Entire nations were destroyed or dislodged, resulting in large migrations of people invading other countries. The sea peoples is what historians call those, looking for promised lands, a place to settle down with their gods again and start another bicameral civilization. One of the reasons that we still have problems in this area of the world, I think, goes right back to this chaotic time. Another cause is writing itself. Because once something is written, you can turn away from it and it has no power over you, in contrast to auditory hallucinations, which you cannot shout out. Writing, particularly as used extensively in Hammurabi's hegemony, weakened the power of auditory directions. The spread of writing, the complexities of overpopulation, and the chaos of huge migrations as one population invades another. These are the obvious causes. And in this breakdown, various things started to happen, including, I think, the beginning of consciousness itself. The immediate results of this loss of hallucinated voices giving directions are several and new in world history. The idea of heaven as where the gods have gone, the idea of genii or angels as messengers between heaven and earth, the idea of evil gods such as demons, all are new phenomena. By 1000 BC, people in Babylon were walking around draped with amulets and charms, which they wore to protect themselves from a huge variety of demons. Such charms have been found archaeologically in the thousands dating from this period. Okay, so again, a lot to chew on, but what you see there is, it's a hinge factor, to use like a historical term, where you can at least start to grasp or think about, okay, why would this happen? Like, if what he's saying is true, that there is what he calls a bicameral mind, where you would once hear things that you could label as hallucinations if you wanted to, and you hear them regularly, and then you stop. Well, what's caused the stop? Well, it might be a trauma like the volcano Thera erupting, causing dislocations of populations, causing cities to be ruined that are in and around the Mediterranean Sea, that are, often port cities. And then you're going to have masses of migrants. You're going to have that to contend with. And that's what, basically, the Egyptian kingdom almost it was like one of the few kingdoms that was able to kind of hold things together. But everything else, if you look at like Crete and the Minoans, they were not able to. If you look at places around like what would be today Lebanon, or the coast of like Turkey, the things that were not as, together and structured and ancient as Egypt, and had like, the infrastructure, for lack of a better word, to contend with this upheaval, they just fell by the wayside. And it's like the only thing I could even begin to kind of compare it to would be like something like what we dealt with in the Middle Ages with the bubonic plague, where it killed, anywhere from 35 to 50% of population. That's going to be a pretty traumatic event, and something like that wasn't caused by a virus, but was caused by probably, geological and climate things, like the eruption of Thera is kind of the catalyst for the Bronze Age collapse, most likely. And I mean, it's not like people, again, he's not saying that like if you just plucked any random person from Egypt out and said, okay, in that time period, like they're not experiencing voices anymore. None of them are. no, that's not what happened. It's that from is the archaeological evidence that we have, that it appears that it's starting to unravel, and who knows exactly, how long it took, but he uses other illustrations that we have to kind of lend credence to his hypothesis. And the thing that he also talks about is, like, because you got to go to literature, right? You got to go to, like, what do you, like, give me something tangible. And so what does he use? He goes to the Iliad, which is, like, the oldest literature that we have in the Western world. If we now move to Greece, just following the period I've been referring to in Mesopotamia, we can trace the bicameral mind as shown in linear B tablets, the type of writing that they had, then going through the Iliad, the Odyssey, through the lyric and Iliadic poetry of the next 2 centuries. You're talking 600 BC-ish at this point. Solon comes on the scene, the great lawgiver to Athens. And Solon is the first person who seems like us, talks about the mind in the same way as we might. He is the person who said, "Know thyself." Although sometimes that's given to the Delphic oracle. How can you know yourself unless you have an analog I, right? Quote unquote I, narratizing in mind space and reminiscing or having episodic memory about what you have been doing and who you are. In Greece, then, one can see in detail the invention and learning of consciousness on the basis of metaphor and analogy. Now, this is key in what he thinks consciousness is. It's clearly linked to linguistics and in writing, and to using metaphor, in language. By tracing out through these writings the change in the words like phranes with a ph, cardia, psyche, what I have called preconscious hypostasis, from objective reference to mental functions. So the same kind of development has been studied in ancient China by Michael Carr at the University of Arturo, comparing the 4 successive parts of the most ancient collection of texts. He found the same internalization process for such words as zine, until they become the concept of mind of consciousness in China. Another area of the world during this period where we can see this rise of consciousness is more familiar to most of you. This among people who may have been refugees from the Thera eruption. The word for refugees in Akkad, A-K-K-A-D, another ancient people, Akkad, the ancient language of Babylon, and is the word kaburu, and this becomes our word Hebrew. The story of the Hebrews, or really one branch of the Hebrews, is told in what we call the Hebrew Testament or the Old Testament. Those of you who know biblical scholarship, JP, will know that the Hebrew Testament is a patchwork of things put together around 600 BC. The date keeps coming forward. Using it as evidence is therefore something of a problem, but there are several ways of entering this mosaic of much edited text to test the theory. And here I shall mention only one. If we take the pure books, those that are not patchwork but are singly authored and that can be clearly and firmly dated, and compare the oldest with the most recent, such as comparisons should reflect differences in mentality we are referring to. So he's going to talk about, what can we tell from these, scholarly, like, show you on the doll, so to speak, point to the when this occurred. The oldest of them is the book of Amos, dating from about 800 BC. And the most recent is the book of Ecclesiastes, which comes from about 200 BC. I suspect that such prophets as Amos were those left over bicameral or semi-bicameral persons in the conscious era who heard and could relay the voice of Yahweh with convincing authenticity, and who were therefore highly prized in their societies as reaching back to the secure authoritarian ways of the lost bicameral kingdom. Amos is not a wise old man, but a shepherd boy brought in from the fields of Tekoa. Probably much of his life has been spent in the fields listening to older shepherds glorifying in the tales of Yahweh. Asked if he is a prophet, he does not even know what the word means, but periodically he burst forth with, quote, "Thus saith the Lord," as the King James Bible translates it, and outpours some of the most powerful passages in Jewish history with such authenticity that he is always surrounded by scribes taking down his words. Okay. So you want to say something about that, I would imagine. Right? About the book of, about Amos, right? It's let me just one little bit extra. The Ecclesiastes is just the opposite. He begins by saying that, quote, "I saw in my heart that wisdom, excellent folly." 2:13, a metaphoric use of sea. Okay, so this is important. So when I said earlier that Julian Jaynes relies on the use of language and specifically metaphor and analogy, this is important because when you use the word see, SEE, spaticalized, like spatial intelligence, right? Time is something that I have. He doesn't. He. It's very important in his notion of consciousness because once you start thinking in time space, then we start, in his opinion, getting closer to the hallmarks of consciousness.
Oh, okay. Okay. All right. Now I was like, yeah, okay. I was just like,
just a little bit more because I know it's a lot. We cannot think consciously of time apart from making a space out of it. We can't think consciously apart from time and space, is what he's saying. And this is very much in evidence in Ecclesiastes, as, for example, in the oft quoted but still beautiful hymn to time that begins the 3rd chapter, quote, "For everything there is a season, and in a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die," and so on, with times like spaces for everything. Historically, we could go further into the New Testament and note that even greater importance of conscious internalization and changing behavior from within, in contrast to Mosaic law that shaped behavior from without. So what he's saying, right, is that if you look at the Bible, that in his opinion, you can see a delineation between, commands coming from without, right, from God, to more like commands coming from an internal source, what we would identify as conscious today. And like, again, to me, it doesn't mean that I know it's unnerving in a lot of ways to be like, okay, wait a minute, is he saying that like God, it's just hallucinating and it's just voices in your head, and then we get to a more identifiable form of consciousness in the New Testament, and therefore it's a break from that, and so therefore it's just hallucinating. God is just voices in your head. And again, I don't think that you have to take it that way, but it is challenging, and I don't want to make this into like a theological religious debate or something or whatever. I just want to contend with that for the purposes of the show, because it's like you can kind of, I think you can kind of take it a couple different ways. And the way I take it is that, I kind of use the similar notion of like, what if we find out that there's life in other planets, right? What if we find out that, that somewhere in the galaxy, that there's other life? That does not, in my opinion, mean that the Bible's wrong, that, Jesus Christ isn't the Son of God, that it wasn't, that everything that we know in the Bible is wrong, and so on. To me, it just means that, okay, there's life in another planet, and I don't think a lot about that. I'm just using that as an example. I don't have much of an opinion about it. I don't think it's important, really. But it doesn't disprove God. You know what I mean? And so in the same token, I don't think that even if Julian Jaynes' ideas, hypothesis, even if you want to call it a theory, is wrong. I mean, is if it's true, then that means religion is wrong. No, but that I just wanted to say that for people's, listening to know that, it's a lot to take in, but it's what we're talking about, basically.
Yeah, like how can other life forms disprove, other intelligent or conscious sentient beings disprove that God doesn't exist? Well, first of all, like you need there's the distinction, with obviously Christianity, like if they're made or if we're made in the image of God, then how can other conscientious or sentient beings that do not look like us be made in the image of God? So there's that overlap that's there. I for one definitely I subscribe more to the idea that, those beings are fallen, are fallen evil beings, because they're in
Yeah, I mean, if
defiance
they,
of him.
yeah, and the way I take it
But
is just that it's a mystery, like it would just be another
yeah,
mystery to me. That's
well,
what I
it's
would.
oh yeah.
It's like in the mind of God. If you believe in God, then God's created everything, and
Hmm.
I have no qualms with that. And it's like, why would there be other life on other planets? I have no idea.
but
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 if
the
it,
whole bicameral thing is just like it. I mean,
it's
it's
kind of like,
it's
okay,
really
why?
interesting.
Well, it's like some
Uh,
of the things, like if we are fundamentally different in some sort of biological way than we were, it's like the human evolution question.
mhm.
Like if there were these other primates, right? This is probably a better analogy besides the alien life forms. Let's just use another one. Let's talk about
How
a
are we
little bit about.
different from monkeys?
Yeah, it's like clearly we are, but like
Yeah.
but if like there was Homo erectus and Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon, etc. And then all of a sudden there's uh, Homo sapien. It comes on the scene. Well, it's like, even if that is how it went down, who's to say that it wasn't God's plan for that to be the way it went down? You know what I mean? Like, I don't
Hmm.
think one disproves the other, is what I'm saying.
Uh
You know,
so in a
like,
way, it's a Venn diagram, so to speak, because it's
yeah.
you do have that overlap because it's like, well, if they exist, does that disprove it? I mean, evolution definitely disproves and proves a lot when it comes to the created order and the natural and how the natural order should be established. Um, and there's obvious connotations to that, but the main context is like, well, you have this established order, and now you have to follow this order because I've commanded you to, and I've given you life, and I've given you. Well, see, there's the breakdown with me because I do believe like animals do act on instinct, but they're clearly conscious beings because you said a dog being
Hmm. Pavlovian.
Pavlovian
Yeah.
trained.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like a dog is conscientious of the fact that once that bell rings, I'm going to get fed. I know that there's an instinctual aspect to it, but how the dog recognizes that ringing of the bell and their mouth waters to receive that. I mean, they have to be consciously awake and aware to act on instinct. Otherwise, you can't have a dead animal or a dead person act not act on or they're not going to act on instinct because they know they cease to exist. So there's that conscientious factor. The factor of consciousness is tied to a sentient existence. I think that's just part of the makeup. That's just part of both the biological and what's within someone or something. There's a soul. There's a soul connected to the body, and that's what gives the consciousness a power. That's what gives it the drive to exist.
Yeah, I it's like, it's just one of those things that's like, we're not going to solve that here. It's like,
No,
it's like, I don't think that it's, it doesn't unnerve me or some, it doesn't take away from the, Jesus coming or dying for our sins, or being the Son of God, or any of the Christian precepts of how to live, or what the meaning
there's
of life.
There's a lot of Jungian archetypes. Oh, yeah, the big questions. There's a lot of Jungian archetypes within that too. Like, there's a whole lot of, like, you basically have the different civilizations play their different roles, because I mean, if you look during that time period, you had the Zoroastrians were kind of like the Magi. They were kind of like the clerics, the priests, and the wizards in a lot of ways. Spread that kind of thinking post and during Egypt / Babylon. So you had that kind of Chaldean, Afghan, Sumerian, Indian, not the Native American,
the Indus River Valley,
Asiatic. Yeah, you had all that kind of stuff kind of come together with that Zoroastrian kind of dialectic, and it kind of it had its turning point into pre-Judaism, pre-Islam, and I have a hard time feigning to it being pre-Christian, because I really think Christianity is on a whole different level with that. But I definitely see there's the mysticism that's tied into it. That's a definite a factor.
And this is where so to bring up like a third person in this kind of trifecta of, okay, how do I grasp the origin of consciousness, and how do I think about it, and what's helpful? We talked about Jung, we talked about Julian Jaynes, and the kind of third guy I bring in is Jean Gepster, who Gepster is a German, like, he's basically a philosopher in a lot of ways, but he's also someone that was, I would almost call him like a renegade Jungian, in a sense that he was definitely influenced by Jung, but he comes up with his own kind of framework for understanding consciousness, and he writes this book called the Ever-Present Origin. And the reason why he calls it the Ever-Present Origin is because he's talking about how he thinks consciousness unfolded, and that's like a good metaphor. And we're I think forced to like basically think of it as an unfolding, essentially, instead of like clear, precise demarcation, or linear, like a linear line of like, okay, these people were not conscious, and then all of a sudden we are conscious, which seems like it's more like that with Julian Jaynes, but it's not. It's a lot of people that have problems with Julian Jaynes, they when I say people in general, I mean like rebuttals to it, criticisms of it on a more scientific way or a psychological way, they will often mischaracterize like his, his ideas. And like, again, this is coming from somebody that, from me, who, I'm not some type of authority on it. It's just fun to talk about and think about. And so with Gene Gepster, he basically thinks about there's like 4 transitions in this unfolding of consciousness. He identifies really 5, but the first 4 are what he calls archaic, and then the second one's magical, third is mythical, fourth is mental, and the last is integral. And so if we break down these, what they mean, okay, is in the deep recesses of time, he would say that the structure of consciousness was archaic. And what he means by that is there's not like a past to overwhelm and a future to is complete potentiality. So in these people's minds, it's very like, it's speculative. We don't know. We have no written record. And consequently, that which we understand or intuit about consciousness is qualitatively different from this original structure. So what hampers any investigation into how it, unfolded in the beginning is, like I said, we have no written testimony. We have no record. And so in this state, though, it's swallowed up by primal shadows of far distant past. It's in the deep recesses of time. It's referred to in legends and myths, but these references are much later time, right, when they're written down. About all we can say in this regard is that within archaic structure, the consciousness is quite undifferentiated. It's just there, and things happen. Man is still unquestionably part of the whole of the universe in which he finds himself in, right? There's people running around doing the hunting and gathering thing, before domestication of crops. The process of individuation of consciousness, of becoming conscious in any sense of the word, has not taken place. This type of consciousness can be likened to a dimly lit mist devoid of shadows, is what he says. This is not consciousness in any sense that we would understand it today. Instead, it can be likened to a state of deep sleep, one that eludes the specifications of particularity or uniqueness. And he basically has to just like say, look, man, we don't know, okay, what it was like before people wrote down anything as far as what they were thinking. And like, if you look at Julian Jaynes, right, like I said a while ago, that it's important to know that, like, we can, when we think about what consciousness is not, it's not your habits. Like, you can be a person running through the jungle or the savannah or what have you, and hunting things, and you can even be taught things. You can even get things done. Otherwise we wouldn't have existed. But that doesn't mean that you're conscious in the sense that we think of it. The second stage that Gene Gepster goes into is what I think he aptly calls the magic structure of consciousness. And he says, around some unspecified time far back in our past, a change took place. Man entered into a second phase of development and gained a new structure of consciousness, the magical structure. This structure is characterized by 5 primary characteristics. 1, egolessness. There is no ego in any sense. It is a spacelessness and a timelessness. 3, it's point-like unitary world. In other words, everything is one. Everything is connected. Any type of idea of like why things happen, or the heavens, or here in the terrestrial realm versus the there's no divide between the temporal and the spiritual. And so it's like a unified world. And 4th, it's interweaving with nature. So it's very connected to nature. in the magical form of consciousness. Think of like shamanism would be an example of this, like, having characteristics, like one of the first kind of cults, essentially, if you want to call it that developed, as far as we could tell, among people that were not civilized, quote unquote, were, identifying with particular animals, and totems, right? Or trinkets, or think of like a voodoo doll, right? Like you are able to make this little figurine, and it's unified with the world around you in the sense that, right? Like you can
I'm
project
sensing a lot of like there's a lot of like Gnostic and perennial and all that like
well, it's
stuff
like
kind of tied in. A lot of
well,
Eastern mysticism
it's like
involved
it.
with it too.
And the reason why I use the voodoo example is because it's just something that everybody can identify.
Yeah.
You know that, like, it's like those guys over there doing their casting their spells and doing whatever weirdness that they're doing, that we think of as, if not Gnostic, at least shamanistic, right? To use a more neutral term. And so fifthly, it's a magical reaction to the world. As a rudimentary self-sense was emerging in language is the real product of this change. So Gepster is saying that maybe we didn't have language in the archaic time, which I kind of agree with, but I won't get into that why, because we can't. It's not useful to speculate. Let's start like getting more. Let's contextualize. Let's get more granular and specific, right? And this starts coming in because we can look at the archaeological evidence of peoples that lived in pre-civilized world. It's not like we don't have any fossil, or not fossil, any bones, or we do. We have burial sites. We have patterns of what people did. Some type of grieving that was obviously going on, some type of ceremony. We get the development of art. We get the development of jewelry, for example. And this is before the old kingdom in Egypt. It's before Samaria in Mesopotamia. So words as vehicles of power are typical of this time and structure. Incantations, spells, right, are precursors to prayer emerge. Consciousness in this phase is characterized by man's intimate association with nature as well. And a good historical example that he uses that we can, at least like most listeners and people can at least know of, is really the ancient Egyptians are kind of sandwiched between what Gepster calls this magical form of consciousness and later the mythic structure of consciousness. And it'll start making sense in a minute, but because and along with the Egyptians, also the Aztecs. So even though and you can see, like, wait a minute, the Egyptians came way before the Aztecs, right? And then people will know that the Mayans came before the Aztecs, but I'm just using the Aztecs as an example. And they're, even the oldest Mayans are, from archaeological evidence, didn't have a civilization anywhere near when the Egyptians did. But I'm using these Mesoamerican people as an illustration to describe what Gepster would call the magical form of consciousness.
Yeah, because there's an overlap too with the Egyptians. Like
yes, okay, because we know, like, people know hieroglyphs, right? Like the writing of the Egyptians, and what we see is the first real, like, instead of just like writing down basically accounting, like the first writing in cuneiform is just like tax. It's literally like used to account for tax collection. It's very, mathematical and very rudimentary and very simple.
It's like pre-Morse code to Morse code.
and the hieroglyphs, though, are like getting a little bit more specified. They mean a little bit more than just tabulating taxes, and they become, when you look at the first, like the oldest Egyptian writing that we have, again, it's like coming later, and what their Egyptian writing is specifying, it's like, we got to write this stuff down, because people are forgetting the spells. They're forgetting the magic that would like support and protect the person in the afterlife, and the mummification and all that entailed, and like the storage in the sarcophagus of, the body and all that. Okay, around that, those structures are literally spells. Okay, but what I'm saying is that existed, okay, in really, really old kingdom Egypt, but we don't get the kind of archival, like papyrus scroll documentation of the spells, so separate from the engravings on the walls and stuff. We don't get that until the Egyptians are kind of frantically writing it down. And it's like, why are they writing this stuff down? Because they're afraid that they're going to forget it, basically, because they're losing, what earlier Julian Jaynes would say, the bicameral mind. They're losing the voices. They're worried about doing the spells correctly. And so they're writing down. Now go over to Central America, Mexico, in a different time, again, lending credence to the idea that this breakdown of the bicameral mind and this development of consciousness, as Gepster puts it, is not happening at the same time in the same places all at once. And the Mayan and Aztec people are very much connected to the magical realm, or the magical structure of consciousness, because when you look at like a guy, like depictions of people, they have literally, the warriors will be like, they'll have like a jaguar head or an eagle head, and they're always depicted with their face coming out of this costume, for lack of a better word. Like, so literally these people are merging, they're united with, again, with nature. The totem, with their,
I'm also getting like a lot of, like, weirdly enough, I'm seeing like samurais as Jedis and Jedis as samurais with this too, because you're kind of getting like, as like technology in the practical form, technology, as far as it advanced in Japan, they still had their old code of honor and their system in place.
And you look at the costumes that the samurai wore. They look, it's like very demons, kind of bestial. It's very demonic, beast-like, crazy looking, whatever. And that's because they have a connection to the magical structure. They're holding on to that. Okay,
that is wild.
Yeah, and this is why I actually, to be honest, I enjoy Gene Gepster more. He's difficult to read than Julian Jaynes, but to me, this helps make it like easier to wrap your head around it. Okay, so we're in the second stage, or second structure of consciousness, with the magical structure. And what ends up happening essentially is that, another feature of the structure is that, bring to mind, is the spacelessness and timelessness. The idea that space and time are illusions that derive from the stage in our development as human beings. The fact that this is one of the first lessons one learns when embarking upon an esoteric path, and further evidence of this idea. To a magic man, right? If you look at a guy that's like, thinks magically, is closely linked as he is with others of like mind. Space and time need not concern him. In fact, I am not convinced that he would understand them anyway, for there is no need that he does so. Magic, however, is very much alive today, and it comes as no surprise, nor should it be, that there is such a strong interest in magic. It seems that the fast-growing branches of occult study, like the Wiccans, right, is one example, overlaid as it is with feminism and similar earth magic studies, etc. What is more what is more is that most vital and emotional of all the structures. We live in a very divisive time, potentially catastrophic times even. But this is a time when emotion rises near the surface of our consciousness, and it is here, okay, it is here in that emotion that magic manifests itself. The proliferation of stories and films dealing with voodoo and similar matters, like, we can all think of horror films that touch on this, and that's probably the best modern illustration of the magical form of consciousness, coming out on the screen, right? That you watch a film. Yet this is not the only structure that seems to be making a comeback these days, is what Gepster says. And we'll get into the mythic structure. But I think that it's good to like kind of pause and like digest that for a little bit, So I mean, think about it, James. Like when you think about, I'm not even a fan of horror films per se, but of course I'm aware of them, and I've seen some obviously. And can't you see like ghost stories or hauntedness or dealing with like the big unknown, right? Aliens, like, that type of thing is tapping in to the magical structure of
like
consciousness.
another, and in a way it's invoking, the primal fears too, because it's like well, you always have the good old our boy Dr. Peterson and the archetypical basilisk or dragon. Why in the West, why do we have that fear of something that looks, well, snake-like, reptilian? It's got predator claws, it's got predator teeth, it's got predator eyes. It's why do we have that?
It's evoking something from the past. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's evoking fears.
Looking at it. Yeah.
It's like go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, that's like the, well, pun intended, but that's, the devil we know. That's the devil that's in front of us. That's the snake in the garden, right?
Yep.
But then you have the other side. What's the unknown? Where's that deep primal fear coming from the unknown? Well, is it coming from
it's probably coming from
outer space, or
it's probably coming from the deep recesses of our collective unconscious, for lack of a better word.
Well, collective,
call it what you want. I mean, another guy, not to derail too much, but like it's relevant. Rupert Sheldrake is a scientist that has developed this concept of morphic resonance, and it's just another name in my view of like a collective unconscious where you have, to give an example, like you basically, he did experiments where mice that had never been exposed to snakes or cats, predators, he would take like literally cat piss and put it near or around, the cages and areas where these mice were at, and they would instinctually freak out. Now you can, and even Peterson has touched on this, like they will literally scream essentially in their little mouse vibrations for like just like they're just freaking out, and they're not stopping freaking out for a really long time. So they're traumatized by something that they've never been exposed to. There's not a cat in front of them. It's just the scent. Now, how do you explain that if they've never seen it, they've never heard it, they've never, smelt it? Okay. And so it's like, you have to.
How does a cat know how to kill a mouse if it's never seen a mouse before?
Yeah, there's some type of connection to their ancestors that had done that their whole life. So it's why we have an instinctual fear of snakes. Most people do. It's because it taps into this magical structure of consciousness. And I think once we get into the mythical structure next and the mental structure, the third and fourth structure, this will start becoming even more apparent with these connections. and in the Christian context, and as a 21st century man, we can start like, oh, this looks more like something that we can identify with. Okay, so a mythical structure of consciousness is named that, because it comes from the idea of a narrative myth, and so this structure can be considered two-dimensional since it is characterized by fundamental polarities. So you touched on quite aptly about Zoroastrianism and the dualism that you see in Zoroastrianism. So this is when it comes through, and it comes through in what other historian has named the Axial Age. It's when it's pretty all within a very kind of couple 100-year period. You get philosophers like Socrates. You get and before him a little, you get like the Homeric epic being written down, like we touched on a little bit earlier, and so we're moving from the unitary one-dimensional thinking of the magical structure, right? Because like I said, things are in the magical structure. There is no clear delineation from the spiritual realm, or whatever you want to call it, the heavens, the God or gods, and how we live here and now, and you moving through the world. It's all connected. And in the mythical structure, it starts becoming a little more dualistic. So he says that word was the reflector of inner silence. Myth was the reflector of the soul. Religion appears as the interaction between memory and feeling. Man is beginning to recognize himself as opposed to others. The next 30,000 odd years or so spent developing these various mythologies. Language is becoming even more important, and it will be noted, and not only receptive but active language at that. So not the ear. So it's not identified, like the mythic structure is not identified with the ear. I forgot to touch on that. The magical structure is more, if you're going to look at a body part to symbolize it, it's very auditory and ear based. Like in the mythic structure, but the mouth is becoming more important in making transparent what is involved in being, like in your actual being as such, how you live, how you exist in life. The mouth now becomes the spiritual organ. We witness as well the initial consecration of the word I of man. So you start seeing, in a way, a self develop. You start seeing individuation or individuality, for lack of a better word, in the mythic structure. The hero, right? We've talked about that before. Many myths deal explicitly with man's unperspectable separation from nature. So witness the story of the fall in Genesis and its animation to go forth and dominate nature. In the myth of Prometheus and the Greek myth and giving of fire to man, these both indicate a strong awareness of man's differentness from nature. We're breaking from nature. Man is coming into his own. Remember, in the magic conscious, man and nature is one. But in the mythic, we start seeing a separation. And although he's anything but independent of it, one could characterize this as a two-dimensional understanding of the world. Within the circle of believers, whether you're talking about Zoroastrianism or whatnot, or Judaism, is where the important acts of life take place. The mere forces of nature have a beginness. Often they're anthropomorphized, but at a beginness nevertheless. Myth then, or the mythological, is the primary form of expression in this period. Subsets of this basic form would be the gods. Symbols become more important, and mysteries. These figures provide the emerging consciousness with imaginative images around which to center man's knowledge and understanding of the world. If the magic structure of consciousness is the emotional aspect, then the mythical structure is the imaginative one. So we go from just pure emotion to a more imaginative one. And it is this fact that makes mythology so difficult for us moderns to deal with. Okay, because the mythical man is very much attuned to symbols. The plethora of images or gods and the seeming inconsistent pantheons of deities brings the rational mind quickly to confusion. Who can keep track of all these figures, their meanings, their correspondences, and their associations? This is the time of the dream. Up until this time, that is the magical structure of consciousness. Souls and afterlives were not of great importance. At least we do not find a lot of evidence of that. Yet in the fully developed mythical consciousness, this is important. The entire civilization of Egypt, as we know it, revolved around this very issue. When we are told then in certain Roostercarian documents that we must descend into Egypt, we are being told that we must regain, not revert to our mythological heritage. Mouths begin to play a more important role, not only in the shaman and wise person of the tribe, repository of wisdom. Other things like poets, such as Homer, begin to play a more important role in the culture. So we're moving from shamanism to epic poetry. And this does not really begin to happen until the mythological structure of consciousness unfolds. However, the I of man is not yet fully developed. To be sure, but it has developed to the point that it recognizes and demands a separation from nature, from its environment. Think of the Garden of Eden, right? We can take this as evidence of an increasing crystallization of the ego. We are on the way to selfhood. Okay, so again, a lot to take in. I mean, but you start to see, I think of when you think of, let's just deal with the two kind of thing, you have Zoroastrianism, you have Judaism, you have the Greek pantheon, these are kind of coming to the surface. The ancient Persians have their duality, and they have their own myths, right? Ahura Mazda and everything that goes into that. You have the Greeks with, their telling of the Iliad and the Trojan War, and you have the Odyssey with Odysseus and all that goes into it. And you also get the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was an older tale than this time period, but it was compiled, at least for the first time that we know of, probably at the very beginning of what Gepster would call the mythical structure of consciousness. So like I said before, like this axial age where, at the beginning you probably have Homer, it's not saying that of course these stories go back further than whoever compiled them, but it's important that they were compiled nonetheless for the first time during roughly within a few hundred years of each other, like whether we're talking about the Iliad or whether we're talking about those first parts of the Bible that we have evidence of being written down, like Amos and then all the way down to Ecclesiastes. And we also have Buddhist teachings. Buddha comes on the scene in northern India. And we also get the writing down of the Bhagavad Gita, the Hinduism stuff. It's all roughly around the same time where we get these real narrative depictions of these oral traditions that happened before. So, and I think that it also is, it's helpful, to think of it okay, now we kind of start to think of civilization, right? We start, you see ancient Athens, but we know that Egypt was hanging around before that. We know that Mesopotamia was a little bit before that. And, but again, the writing down and saving of whether it be the magical spells that the Egyptians had, whether it be the Epic of Gilgamesh that the Mesopotamians have, or whether it be Homer, they're all within a couple hundred years of each other. even though Mesopotamia and Egypt are quite a bit older than the golden age of Athens. So, it and then you also have the Bible, so it's like, to me, that's like, okay, like there's certainly something different going on, is what I'm saying, than what was. Is it purely like, okay, that we have writing? Well, no, it's not purely that we have writing, but that is part of the picture. It's like you have to contend with the fact that we didn't have writing and then we did, right? So like, is the the technology of being able to be literate and form a language, and then not form a language, but form a writing system, and then get away from just tabulating things, like I said, taxes, to now we're creating a narrative. This, to me, it clearly shows like a, a different stage of consciousness. Um, it doesn't prove that people weren't conscious and conscious, have a internal monologue before, but it's like we have no evidence that people had an internal monologue before that. That's the key. It's like, and I think that, like, when you look at like the Iliad, there's parts of it that are very depersonalized. Like, they're not, when it's been a while since I've read it, but I have read it, and when there's parts of, like, everybody associates the Iliad with Achilles, and Achilles being the hero, and the text is filled with different heroes. Odysseus is one of them as well, Ajax, etc. But Achilles is like probably a later development in the story, and the reason why scholars think that is, even though he gets a lot of attention nowadays, you can tell that he is, when he's acting in the story, he is, very emotive, and he's brooding in his tent, and he, but he's not really going like, I am going to do this, I am going to do that. He's just acting, right? And that's like an indication that he's the way of us kind of thinking about how they thought back then is not the same as how we are, and you start seeing hints that it's becoming, throughout the story, it's the gods, the gods acted upon them, it's them contending with, Zeus, or, whoever, whatever deity is spoken about. And it's like, they're just kind of, players on a chessboard, so to speak, and not so personalized or individualized.
Yeah, like there's no depth, there's no character.
Yeah,
what we would call character development. And this goes back
exactly.
to like the RPG, the RPG archetypes, where you set up with the three main classes. And the weird part about that is that it's like, this is like even prevalent with something as almost from the outset, when things look chaotic, when people say, oh, well, the classic, well, some people get this, some people won't, like Lord of the Rings, or like Warhammer 40K, or
Yeah,
like even sports or a hobby, it's getting the 30,000-foot view all the way down to the, I guess, the yard, getting it down to a yard, getting it down to, well,
yeah, you're
what's
taking owner, like
a
you're
yardstick? Well,
you're
no, and
acting like,
a ruler.
when you're playing that game, you are taking the character and then, giving it details, and you are controlling it, and you are building a narrative around it. But you start off with, like you said, an archetype. And, that's where I think, it's like basically the, Homer or whoever compiled it is like, again, kind of going like, we have this oral tradition. We need to compile it. We need to have it for the historical record, because we're forgetting it. And then they start becoming super self-aware when you see, of course, people like Socrates come on the scene, and he starts questioning these stories in a lot of ways. And he also starts thinking like, okay, what does it mean to like live a good life, or what does it mean to, what is the good life, and you start developing these different philosophies, like whether it's the Stoics, or the Epicureans, or Dionysius, whatever the guy is.
Dionysius.
Yeah,
Yeah.
something like that. And it's like all these different schools of thought come out of this time, and
Yeah.
there's no I don't think it's like
asking like what is good, what is bad,
yeah,
what's
and
the
it's like
differences,
it's showing clearly like what we could start identifying as clearly conscious. They're
yeah.
they're not just like moralizing or saying God tells us to do this, or you know they're not just depicting a god in a statue, though they're still doing that. They are starting to really formulate
Well,
a system of
yeah.
governance, a system of life.
And the weird part is you see this in the Renaissance, like you see this come back and revivify itself through
Yeah.
the Italian Renaissance. There was even a Renaissance that happened, and I learned this not too long ago, a Belgian Renaissance. And it was like, Belgian / French,
Yeah.
Renaissance that happened before the Italian one did. And the weird part is like those old archaic ideas came back, and they came back in a form to where the modern interpretation is. And then you see that, not only do you see that through art, which is a very obviously it's a very expressive, somewhat subject, art's got all kinds of implications to it, right? But you get the Renaissance it just didn't happen on accident either. There was a manifestation of people being sick and tired of the new or modern ways of what was going on. So you had your classical, all the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles turned back to, it turned back to, revivifying those classical archetypes through their sculptures, through their paintings, through their poetry, through their writings, through their, look at Da Vinci, and he basically was when you say Renaissance man, there's an archetype right there. Who do you think of as a Renaissance man? Da Vinci, right?
Yeah.
So that's it's crazy. It's not crazy to think about that, but it's ancestral too, because they were hearkening back to the Greco-Roman ancestors, right? So they were taking back that lineage and saying, these structures were built. The Acropolis was built. The Colosseum in Rome was built. I like the structure of I don't know the names of I'll be honest, the Roman gods much, but like whoever Athena was for the Romans at the Colosseum, Da Vinci was like, well, I can do that, but I can do that better. Or What's the other? There's another classical one that I'm probably David. Was probably another classical one. You know, they had David. His archetype would probably be, I don't want to say Hercules, but his effort to kill Goliath was Herculean.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah, you
mean,
start seeing these heroes break through.
yeah,
In our
yeah.
time. And
And it's just like he made one of the most famous sculptures of all time, and he dedicated it to, like you said, a hero. And where does that hero come from? And not only did he give obviously he gave David those neoclassical features, but in a lot of ways it made, well, obviously it doesn't shame David in any way because he sculpted him in the nude, but he also like in a way, in a weird way, took what the good was and what the culture was at the time, trying to achieve that manifestation or that collective consciousness, and he put it into a sculpture. But this, at the time, the sculptors trying to sculpt, well, and this is pre Bible days too, where they were trying to sculpt um, a manifestation of, like you said, a hero, or a manifestation of something that's collectively good, either in the subconscious or in the conscious, which is crazy to think about that I just went that in depth with the statue, but it's there. Like you can see it in his, in his muscular structure and his, I mean, it's all there because of how important of that reflection of humanity is into, more artistic concepts rather than Christian ones.
yeah, and what you're saying about the Renaissance, Gepster definitely uses into the next stage of consciousness from mythic into what he calls the mental structure, and it's a good word because it basically, we've hinted at it with the philosophers, but that the Greeks are kind of the what a lot of people think about, and the Renaissance, gives a rebirth to this to the all these philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, but also other things. But the other thing is that in the mental structure, key development is the more we start seeing like really what we would identify as like an ego, as an I, as a self, and it shows itself in art from perspective, perspective painting, basically. When Leonardo da Vinci has when you see like a painting, you're getting one perspective of whatever plane, whatever is being displayed. So perspective painting, is a development that comes out of the Renaissance, and it signifies I kind of, for the first time in art, seeing like, okay, when you look at like a famous painting of like the Lyceum or what have you, where you'll have like Plato on one side and Aristotle on the other, and it's linear perspective. It's showing you one perspective and centering on one view. Okay. And that is a major development, in art. And so it kind of signifies and shows, in the historical record, like there's another, we're kind of breaking off from one form of or structure of consciousness into another. Um, and it's in that, okay, you start also you also start seeing things like, okay, it's basically so let's let me go back a little bit. So um, about this time, Gepster says the Renaissance man came into his own and really mastered space. It was at this time that perspective was actually introduced into art. Since that time, perspective has come to a major aspect of our mental functioning. Perspective is the lifeblood of reasoning and the rational structure of consciousness, right? So, which Gepster considers to be only a deficient form of the mental structure. What we have is a full development of the ego and its related centeredness. We conceive of things, events, phenomena in terms of our own perspective, often at the expense of others. The I, it will be seen in the last of the openings in the head, become the spiritual organ representative of this structure. So now it's more about the I instead of the mouth from the mythic or the ear from the magical. Our language, our entire imagery and dominant metaphor takes on a visual spatial character. Space is finally overcome in the true sense of the word. With the supersession of space, man finally accomplishes his egotistic individual separation from nature. In this consecration of the I, we become very aware of our existence, of our beingness, of our individuality. And so it should be, but in a deficient mode. The outcomes, of course, are loneliness, isolation, alienation, which are so characteristic of our own American culture. In fact, our current materialistic approach to understanding reality is perhaps the final stage of the structure. There is also much everyday evidence to indicate that we are moving through a great change. We should remember, however, that this is also the time of philosophy. The mental orderings and systemization of thought become the real dominant mode of expression. The myths have lost their vibrancy and existential connection to reality. Greek thought, followed later by the scholastics, and finally with the Enlightenment, are all periods in which this particular structure of consciousness flourishes and strongly manifests. It's not without opposition, since any change would bring forth a requisite opposition to its own development. By this time in the Renaissance, though, this structure had firmly established itself and was prepared to move into the next phase of its development. At this time, as pointed out earlier, a very profound and significant event occurred. Man incorporated space into his thought. We cannot underestimate or overstate the importance of this development. It is literally at this time the world begins to shrink. The seeds of our one world community are planted at this time. The ripples begin during the magical structure are widening significantly. First spirit, then soul, now space has become constants of man's consciousness. 3 dimensions have been established, and we are prepared for the next significant step we are taking now. Okay, so basically, in all that, the reason why I brought up the artwork and linear perspective painting is because it, like he says, it shows like a demarcation from thinking of things and viewing things as, unified in nature or even dual in nature. It goes, now we're at the I, we're at the individual, we're at, the perspective of one person, whoever that one person is, being displayed in a painting. And, you also start to see the development of, with another Renaissance painter in Rembrandt. He popularizes the self-portrait. You don't have self-portraits or portraits too much until him, until this time, until the Renaissance. And then you start seeing it just kind of proliferate, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what do we have today? Like, we have people obsessed with
selfies.
Yeah.
Then talk about a collective, a collective consciousness / subconsciousness with that, because I mean that could go right into idolatry, straight up idolatry. I mean, you start idolizing yourself, and then I mean, it can go.
You're seeing a break from religion. That's why he said the mental structure is connected to the Enlightenment. It's connected to the Renaissance. Before that, it's connected to really wanting to rationalize and develop systems of thinking and theory, right, of how the world works.
But you could also see it as like, well, maybe these people that are so obsessed with how they look, you could be like, well, maybe they want to go back to the neoclassical way of looking at they
Yeah,
did
they're
this
comparing.
statuesque Renaissance. You know, I mean,
Well, it's like,
that's a little bit easier of
what is
probably
social?
something to.
It's like, what does social media do to people? A lot of times is they end up looking at, these filtered images, and
Yeah.
they end up comparing themselves, especially, I mean, men do this, but especially women do it even more typically, and it's a reason for a lot of angst, I think, in people's lives today, is because you're always getting this kind of filtered view of someone's life that's, of course, just a snapshot of basically a random picture.
Well, the weird part is like, not to get completely like morbid on you or bad, but men, when they commit suicide, they usually shoot themselves in the face or do something, catastrophically violent. Whereas women will take pills, they'll do some kind of like chemical intoxicant to off
they don't
themselves.
Want to distort their body.
Right. There's a vanity to it. And why would women have the inclination to have, do it in a, well, I mean, this is kind of weird, but I guess a more graceful or self-preserving manner, rather
it's
than
because of it's like, well, there's a lot of things going on there probably, but the important thing to, I think, as far as the context of what we're talking about, is that you do not see self-portraits until about 600 years ago, bottom line. Okay, like when you look at art, ancient art, people they're representing the gods, they're representing maybe heroes later, but they're not representing themselves. And when they start representing themselves, they, and like, we certainly have bust or sculptures of great men like Pericles, the statesman of Athens, or any number of people. Like the Romans, did this with Caesar and Pompey.
Caesars,
and, they would have death mask, where they would have basically like they would put a form over their face and then make it into a sculpture, and that's a form of that's certainly a form of preserving your image, but it does not proliferate in the degree that it does after the 1500s with self-portraiture. And then you see the development.
There's also a development of culture there too, where you have the obvious development of culture that is so prominent in like the accessibility to painting, the accessibility to canvas. There's obviously technological advances with that, but who says that doesn't come from a collective conscious? Why would human beings go from, well, I could sculpt this out of stone, but I'd much rather paint this? Is that an access to a technological advancement, or is there's also a functionality to it too? It's like, well, like, but who, but who would want to say, well, I'm going to go sculpt this willingly, screw that painting crap, it's not for me. I'm going to go sculpt this and prove my worth. There's also that, but who's, you got, it's so funny to me, because it's like
another thing that's
you always have the
related to.
Go ahead.
Well, I mean, just real quick, like another thing that's related to like this identification with quote unquote I, yourself. The first time that we have like literally the word I in any type of historical record, as far as I know, is with a funny enough, with what would be like a Scandinavian horn, that basically, like, someone made a drinking vessel out of a horn, right?
Oh,
and,
yeah.
and he says in carved into it in the language of basically Northern European Germanic, is I so and so made this horn. Okay, like, and that happens, probably like way later than you would think it happens. It's not like it's not it's I can't. I wish I knew. I wish I had it pulled up, but it's basically, and I can't even think of the name of it, but it was from an archaeological paper that I stumbled across like months ago, that when I was like kind of really delving into this like again, and it comes, like I said, from basically like what would today be Denmark or Norway, and it's pre-Christian, and it's also, the people that were there were, it wasn't in the BC era. It was 80, and it was again like probably roughly around like even the fall of the Roman Empire, of the Western Roman Empire. And so it really wasn't that long ago. And so it's not that we have correspondence, from dignitaries and stuff like that, and Cicero, and all this writing from like, roughly, I don't know, 70 AD. And, but I'm saying that, and we have, documentation from like, say, way before that with like, the Persian emperor, doing, basically making some formal pronouncement, and ordering his troops. And of course, people would be, we have things from like, roughly, plenty of documentation from like 450 BC, with the ancient Greeks, like we've talked about. But this kind of real ownership of something that somebody created, and wanting people to know, like, I made this, right? It becomes kind of like, it kind of comes on the scene, so to speak, not that long.
First branding or fashion statement, really. Like it's it's like saying, this is my stamp on.
Yeah, and it's like in like, like we'll have like the Olympics or something, like you will have a list of people that won such and such event, like the chariot racing or the decathlon or whatever, and we'll have like the winners of the famous like plays in ancient Greece. There'll be dedications to, Aeschylus because he won that year, or Sophocles or Euripides or whoever. And it's like notifying people like, look, this person did this thing, and it's a celebration and it's an honor and so on. But we don't really get, we don't get very much, like you said, branding essentially. And it's like, and not just that, it's like, the statement of just using the word I, and it's like, that is an important development of going back to like, okay, when is consciousness developed, in the sense that we could associate with something that we consider consciousness now. It's very much kind of this individualistic identification of yourself and you as an actor, in life, and like, okay, I'm doing whatever I'm doing, and not acting in a way that like you're not third person, it's first person narrative, like another thing to kind of illustrate this, like, we don't have really novels, until the famously, like Cervantes, Don Quixote, sometime in the like late 1500s, like 80, again around the Renaissance, we get like essentially what people mostly consider the first novel. But it's like a standalone thing. You don't see these popping up all over the place. You get some other things like Boccaccio's Decameron, which is a little bit earlier than that, during the bubonic plague in the 1300s. You get some other things, but for the most part, you get the Canterbury Tales, but you don't really get, that's not the Canterbury Tales and Decameron. They're not really novels that are centered around a character like Don Quixote, and it's just not the same. Like when you look at Don Quixote, it becomes something, even though it's 500 years old, that you can like go, okay, this is a novel. And whereas the Canterbury Tales and the Decameron are like stories that are told about whatever they're talking about. It's just
a collection of writings versus a fluent and or fluid,
very centered on one person.
classic, introduction to climax to ending. Yeah.
And the reason why I bring it up is because when you look at the novel, and of course, like you definitely pointed out correctly that, like, we got to be careful about why we say self-portraits became proliferated. Is it really a development of consciousness, or is it also, the technology and the culture milieu around it? And that is very important to keep in mind. But it's also, when you look at the novel, though, you have literacy that comes on the scene, right? More people start being able to read, and you get into like the 1700s and the mental structure of consciousness, where you start seeing the Enlightenment, right? And you start rationalizing, developing systems, etc. But you also start actually having, basically narrative stories that are centered around one person, or very few people, and a protagonist, etc. But you also, to be able to enjoy the story, it's a very individualistic thing. Like, you're not sitting around a campfire hearing someone talk. You are in a quiet place alone for the most part, because you have to be able to sit down and read. And it's a very individual experience, right? You're reading this novel, and you are probably starting to identify with the character in some way, and projecting yourself into it in some way, or at least like identifying characteristics of whatever character that you're associating, like in some sense, like, oh, I could see myself doing that, or and it becomes a very an eye-centered thing, right? It's not like you're doing a communal, cooperative storytelling, of the Iliad or the Odyssey or the Epic of Gilgamesh. Where you're sitting around with your family and extended kin and whatever, and someone's telling the story at a campfire or what,
Right. It's a collective consciousness of one instead of many. But then again, that also ties into, like, I guess you could say more so the magical aspect, because you also have like or you touched on it with the occult, or those kind of societies there's that collective consciousness of one, but there's also that collective consciousness of many as one.
Yes.
They have that dualistic dynamic to it. They also,
it's all
in a lot of
blending,
ways,
it's blending, right? I mean,
yeah, but in other ways too, they make distinctions too, because it's like, well, it could be dualistic, but then you have dualistic where it is literally just black and white, right? But then you have the yin and the yang, where that white dot is in the black and
yeah,
that black
yeah,
dot is in the white, where it's influencing it. Why is it influencing it? Well, without that, you can't have balance. And if you don't have balance to these opposing forces, well, then these opposing forces can't exist one another, because the superior one, or the superior one at the time, will take over the inferior one, and there won't be any balance to it. So therefore, there's not going to be a line of demarcation. It's just going to be that superior force will rule out and win, which obviously to Christians represent God, and him conquering
yeah.
the
Like
devil,
the
sin.
The Lord of the Rings illustrates that.
Oh yeah,
And,
yeah. That's okay.
yeah.
But
It's like, and you see, look at, give it another example, like in the Lord of the Rings, like we've talked about before, like you have the interplay of, you have the synthesis of all of these things. In a lot of ways, you have the magical structure of consciousness, with literally, like, different types of the ring of power, right? We talked about like how the in the magical structure of consciousness, you would have some sort of amulet, trinket, thing that has
and even and see, that's the weird part too. Even look at like our like most human instinct to have something of value, like a ring or an amulet or a trinket, and have that thing that's valuable. And well, a ring kind of represents, obviously, because it's a circle, so it represents eternity.
yeah,
But there's also that, well, why would you have that thing that symbolizes either an eternity of creation, or an Ouroboros, an eternity of destruction? And why would you have that primal thing? But it's not. But see, in the other aspect, it is kind of primal, but it is also new, because I mean,
create
jewelry and things. Yeah,
you create, like with the ring, like with the
yeah,
wedding band, there's a whole narrative that goes around it, which would tie into the mythical consciousness.
yeah,
And
yeah.
then on top of that, you have now, we'll have our own mental or rationalization of why you have the ring, right? Like, it's not just a story behind it or a symbol. It's also like, well, I have it because it reminds me of my duty as a husband. It also, I have it because it displays that I'm taken, that I
Yeah,
have been
yeah.
spoken for. And then I have it because because legally in my culture I'm married, and we have documentation for that, and that's a
Well,
more
there's also in a lot of
rational.
ways too. Yeah, and then there's also in a lot of ways too, like, oh, have like, if you've gotten into a fight, or if you
Yeah,
get your first black eye, oh, where'd you get that from? What's the story behind that? You'll have people say that to you. In a way, well, it's a rite of passage, or you got your, either, oh, you should see the other guy type deal, or
Yeah,
you
and the
got
way,
beat, and you got beat, right?
and that's
So,
it's why, like, it's why, story is so important to us even now in the, in 2022, because there is there just to be able to articulate, like, whatever it is that you're trying to explain. A lot of times, the way that somebody learns something, is you're going to use, yes, you're going to use metaphors. Yes, you're going to use analogies, but more than that, you're also going to, even if you're clunky with it and clumsy with it, you're going to have a narrative. You're going to have a story behind whatever it is you're expressing, if it's profound at all. But on top of that, we reach back to symbols, we reach back to archetypes. And, I think that is, a good kind of way of looking at things and seeing that, like, even if the unfolding of consciousness, the ever-present origin of consciousness, like what Gene Gepster calls it, or like Julian Jaynes or Carl Jung, what we can, I think, agree upon or like make sense of is that even if they're missing the mark, so to speak, and aren't 100% right or even 80% right, that you can see how complicated consciousness is and how we view ourselves, in the world that we live in. And then it's not just, even if you're one of those guys that's like really scientific, really rational, think of yourself as a logical person, you can't escape. You can't escape these things. They're connected and interwoven in your life, whether or not you want to, acknowledge it or not. I mean, and I think that
that ever presence always is, it almost seems like also an omnipresence. It also seems like omnipotent in a lot of ways because of like the reality that unfolds before us. Is that like,
and that's language that he would use.
Thing?
I don't mean to cut you off, but that's exactly the type of language that Gene Gepster would use.
It's also pretty Gnostic, but I mean, I mean that.
Let me close out a little bit. Yeah.
Okay.
Let me close out a little bit about like, okay, so where is this leading to? And
for sure,
we'll start wrapping up a little bit. But like, it's like, I think because I think that you've already hinted at some of the things that Gepster is pointing towards, and that's, I think, a good thing. And so the last stage is what he calls the integral structure of consciousness. And as can be guessed, he says, Gepster feels that we are on the threshold of new structure of consciousness, namely the integral. For Gepster, this structure integrates. And you'll hear, what does Jordan Peterson say? Individuation, which is a Carl Jung term. You want to integrate your shadow. You want to integrate these things, these archetypes as well, into your personality. And so Gepster says, this structure integrates those which have come before and so all the other structures, and enables the human mind to transcend the limitations of three-dimensionality. So with the mental structure, with the Renaissance, with the linear perspective painting, with getting the eye, getting the perspective and having like a three-dimensional display, because in art before that time, you didn't have three-dimensionality. You only had two dimensions. So now we're into a fourth dimension of time, if you will. This integration is not simply a union of seemingly disparate opposites. It's not just a union of all these opposites. Rather, it is what he calls the interruption of qualitative time into our consciousness. The interruption of qualitative time into our consciousness. The supersession, not suppression, the supersession of time is a theme that will play an extremely important role in this structure. In fact, the idea of irrationality as opposed to rationality of the current structure. So we're going out of rationality into not irrationality, but irrationality, a perspectivity. So we're moving away from linear perspective of three-dimensionality, and we're starting to incorporate all the forms of consciousness. Okay. And basically there's significant characteristics of this new structures. So stated differently, the tension and relations between things are more important at times than the things themselves. So how the relationships develop over time takes precedence to the mere fact that the relationship exists. It will be this structure of consciousness that will enable us to overcome the dualism of the mental structure and actually participate in the transparency of self and life. This fourth structure toward which we are moving is one of the minimum latencies and maximum transparency. Transparency is not not seen. It's not as one does not see the pane of glass through which one looks out a window. Rather, one sees through things and perceives their true nature. Statements about truth are superseded by statements as truth. And this structure is difficult to describe since it depends on a great deal on experience, not just that we have them, but on how intense they are and what we glean from them for now and in the future. Intensity is a key characteristic of this mode of consciousness. By intensity, I do not mean simply an emotional relationship to experience or feeling or deepening of emotion itself. What I mean is this would be a magical response if that's all it was, not an integral one. Perhaps it would be best to review. And so let us start with intensity and use the analogy of love. Love is the energy, yet it has only recently been referred to as such, or the driving force behind true spirituality and spiritual growth. We learn early as mystics and students of the other arts that we should love our neighbors and as ourselves. This is, in fact, one of the two great commandments given to us by Christ, and the theme of love is one that was very strongly developed by the great apostle St. Paul. However, it is easy to love those who are our neighbors, even though as time they're exasperating because they are so much like us. We recognize ourselves in them, and so we love them. The affinity of interest, the locale, or any other myriad of possibilities making love those who are like us a joy. We fulfill our spirituality by adhering to this commandment. It is a yoke that we gladly bear. Nevertheless, this love is a three-dimensional love at best. We love those who fit neatly into the perspectives of being and life. We choose who they are and when and how often we extend that love. An integral love, a fourth dimension of love, would go beyond that. The Christ also informed us of what that love is when admonished us to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us. It is this love that is intense, for it is required without asking our opinion, our perspective. This is the love of this is the love of Judas. This is the demanding love that not many are willing to offer. So, it's like you were saying, Gnostic and wary of it for good reason, but when he's talking about the kind of integral or this stage of consciousness that we hopefully are probably in, is that even if Gene Gepster is, not someone's theological cup of tea, he ultimately, I think, correctly says that, look, we have these structures of consciousness, and it's dizzying. There's a myriad of things going on. But I think as conscious beings, we can see that ultimately the purpose is driving us towards being able to go to what he calls fourth dimensional thinking or consciousness, where you're able to integrate, there's not really a better word for it, all the forms of consciousness and go back to love, basically, and that's how you do it, and it's the only way that you can do it. And I think that's a nice way to kind of basically end this, but we could, talk about it because it's like a lot to, we've been, streaming for about 2.5 hours, and there was a lot in that. But I mean, it's when he talks about the fourth dimensional thinking, it's not like some thing where you're like, okay, there's more than 3 dimensions, and you're talking about interdimensional stuff here, like, some type of wizardry or magic or something like that. He's saying that, like, to be able to acknowledge and internalize the fact that, if he's right, that there are all these forms or structures of consciousness, and that you can be aware of them, but at the same time integrate them. He's not giving a moral judgment about, oh, we should go back to archaic consciousness when we know nothing about, right? Or that we should go back to magical thinking, or we should go back to mythical thinking, or that we should go, or we should stick with rationalization and mental consciousness. He's saying it's part of you, it's part of us. All of it is. And this is where we find ourselves in. And kind of, I think the only way to kind of be able to not get kind of schizophrenic about it, for lack of a better word, is to just know that you can, the only kind of thing that can bind us together is something like love. It goes beyond.
Yeah, there's a transcendent value. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like a guiding principle, and it's like, but it's not, like you said, it's not the love that's easy. It's not the love that you can 3-dimensionalize and contextualize with the people around you, because that's easier to do. It's harder to be like,
it's superficial.
Yeah, love your enemy, or love the unknown, or the unknown person, or the unknown people. And so I think that it's again, like, it's a lot to take in. It's a lot to deal with. It's like, and I don't know, personally, like, I have, like I said, like, it's not like my opinion is like, like I said, like, I don't think that you can, I think it's like, I don't think that you can say, like, okay, Gene Gepster has it all right, or Julian Jaynes, or Carl Jung, about, of course, I don't go to them for religion. I just go to them for trying to piece together some sort of, I mean, I guess I'm delving into, I guess I would identify with, it's kind of I basically rely on myth and rationality, or mental consciousness, to make sense of it. Like, I'm telling myself a story. The story is possibly how we developed throughout time as sentient beings, and that's basically a story, right? And then I'm using my rationality, or what we think of logic and thinking, to make sense of it. And that's all.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this could definitely be a second parter. Maybe short, maybe a little bit.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it.
But there's.
I mean, it's like, look, it's like, again, like, we're not here to, like, solve the problem of consciousness, but it was a fun discussion. It's like, also, if we do another one on another aspect of psychology, and I hope, like, when you put this out there, like, people respond positively to it, but if, in the sense that, okay, where else can we go from here, like, and I think I talked to you about, like, how
what stems from that consciousness,
herd psychology, right? And, like,
the
problems of that, and contextualize that, and think about, mass psychology, herd psychology. Think about another thinker that I rely on a lot is this guy named Rene Girard, who was a French writer and devout Catholic that saw the danger, in a lot of ways, of collective thinking and what he calls mimetic desire. And mimetic comes from the Greek word, of course, like almost all words do, that we use, mimesis. And mimesis is basically thinking mimetically, or mimicking that which you see, right? And so,
memes.
Yeah, right. So we get into the fun stuff. We get into like a little bit of politics, a little bit about propaganda. We get into all the kind of spicy things that
I think would be interesting to talk about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I learned a heck of a lot.
Well, it was fun. I mean, again, if people are interested, you can look at Julian Jaynes, without getting like, oh, I'm gonna go out and get a big book and read it. It's like you can look at like a PDF that he has on Julian Jaynes Society. The guy passed away a while ago, but he has like a PDF of like a condensed version of his ideas, Julian Jaynes Society. You can look at you know, Gene Gepster's Ever Present Origin is a big old book, and again, like it's super complex. This was just a icebreaker, kind of table talk about it. But there is that source, and of course you can look at archetypes and Jungian's take on those things. But ultimately, it's like the reason why I brought up like Rene Girard is that like with him, it's kind of interesting, maybe to give a little teaser for a potential next future show or something, is that he deals with the fact that you have to have everybody around us, you, me, everyone is gonna have a model that they model themselves after. And this goes into like hero, and potentially like hero worshiping, putting people on pedestals, but it also just more mundane and profane than that. Like in a way, celebrity worship is another thing. But even if it's not that banal or profane, it could be just your father. A lot of people model themselves after their father. But of course, the Christian answer is that you should be modeling yourself as much as possible with Christ. And of course, we're never going to be able to do that perfectly, but it's a model that you can choose. And that's kind of that's like Rene Girard's kind of in a snapshot, like what he comes to. But like the powerful thing is just recognizing that you're not as capable as you might think about being this kind of individual that is completely separate and a special snowflake or whatever, right?
Yeah.
What powers beyond your imagination and beyond, in some ways, if you don't let it, or if you do let it, beyond your control, where you find yourself doing things that you don't even know. And this kind of goes again into like unconscious behavior, and and like, why are you doing the things you're doing? Are you doing it out of habit? A lot of times you're doing it because even if you're not aware, you have oriented yourself towards a model that is probably not the best. But the reason why a big reason why Christianity is so powerful is that we have a contextualized, personified, person, personhood of Christ. And anyway, so that's something to think about too.
Very, very much so.
All right, man. Well, it was good talking to you. It's like, I feel like we had like a kind of a roller coaster of a talk, but it was
just
fun.
A bit. It was. Well, all right. Good night, y'all.
All right. Good night.